The air in the courtroom was a physical weight, thick with unspoken tensions and the collective breath of 100 people waiting for a conclusion. Sunlight, heavy and golden, streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the lazy dance of dust motes over the polished wood of the jury box. It was a room built for drama, for pronouncements that altered the course of lives, and today was no exception. At the center of it all stood Isabella Cruz. Her suit was a simple, sharp navy blue, a careful investment that looked more expensive than it was, a piece of armor for a battle she had been waging for months. She faced the jury, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the lectern, her posture a study in contained energy. She was delivering her closing argument, her voice a clear, unwavering instrument that cut through the oppressive silence. It carried no hint of the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones, the countless nights fueled by coffee and a desperate need for justice. She was systematically, brick by brick, dismantling the labyrinthine case presented by the corporate behemoth known as Bianchi Enterprises. Her client, a man named Mr. Al-Jamil, a small business owner with hands calloused from a lifetime of work, sat beside her, his face a mask of anxious hope. He was being squeezed, suffocated by the predatory real estate tactics of a corporation that saw his small hardware store as nothing more than a footnote on a zoning map. From the defendant's table, Lorenzo Bianchi watched her. He was disguised today, as he always was in public, as a legitimate, powerful CEO. His suit was impeccably tailored, his posture relaxed, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic neutrality, but his eyes, dark and deeply set, were anything but neutral. They followed Isabella's every move, every gesture, every subtle shift in her tone, with an unnerving, predatory intensity. It was a gaze that did not merely see, it analyzed, catalogued, and assessed. He didn't move a muscle, a statue of immense power, yet his focus was so absolute it felt like a physical touch. This isn't about a contract dispute. Isabella's voice rang with a passion she had to fight to control, lest it betray her as naive. It's about a promise, the promise that in this city, a person's life's work, the legacy they hope to leave for their children, cannot be crushed by the powerful and the privileged simply because they can. Bianchi Enterprises wants you to see this as numbers on a page, as clauses and subclauses. I want you to see what Mr. Al-Jamil sees, a lifetime of 16-hour days, the first dollar he ever framed, the community he built around a place that sells not just hammers and nails, but trust. She painted a picture not of corporate greed, but of human dignity, of the fight for a foothold in a world that increasingly favored the giants. She could feel the jury leaning in, their expressions shifting from polite attention to genuine empathy. The thrill of it was a potent drug, a surge of adrenaline that washed away the fatigue. This was her first major victory. She could feel it in the air, a validation of years of sacrifice, of missing family dinners, of pouring every ounce of her being into law books. The squeak of the bailiff's shoes as he shifted his weight was the only sound. When she finished, a profound silence held the room for a beat. Then the judge gave his final instructions. The wait for the verdict was an eternity compressed into 47 minutes. When the jury filed back in, their faces were solemn. Isabella held her breath. The foreman, a woman with kind eyes, stood and delivered the verdict, in favor of the defendant, Mr. Al-Jamil. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. A wave of pure, unadulterated elation washed over Isabella, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She turned to her client, who was openly weeping with relief, and clasped his hand. Amid the quiet celebration, she glanced toward the defendant's table. Lorenzo Bianchi was already standing. His lawyers looked flustered, angry. He did not. His expression was unchanged, but his eyes found hers across the courtroom. In the warmth of her victory, a sudden, inexplicable chill traced its way down her spine. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, and analyzed by a predator who had just been momentarily thwarted, not defeated. The smell of her mother's cilantro lime chicken filled the small, cozy apartment, a welcoming aroma that instantly began to melt the tension from Isabella's shoulders. She came home to a surprise. The living room, slightly cluttered with books and her brother's university textbooks, was decorated with handmade banners. One, painted in wobbly red letters, read, Congrats, Isabella, the giant slayer. Her mother, Elena, a woman whose smile could light up the city, rushed to embrace her. Mija, we knew you would do it. Her younger brother, Leo, a lanky 19-year-old with his father's eyes and an infectious grin, popped the top on a bottle of sparkling cider, the cork flying off with a festive bang. To my sister, he announced, raising his glass. The best lawyer in the entire world. I'm telling all my friends my sister took down Lorenzo Bianchi. Isabella laughed, the sound genuine and relieved. I didn't take him down, Leo. I just won a case for a good man. They toasted, the sweet, bubbly cider, a perfect counterpoint to the richness of the meal Elena had prepared. This was her sanctuary. This small, love-filled apartment was the reason for everything. The long hours, the student debt, the constant pressure. It was all to protect this, to give her family the security she never wanted them to worry about. Leo talked excitedly about his future, his plans for his software engineering degree suddenly seeming more real, more attainable, inspired by his sister's monumental success. Elena watched her daughter, her eyes shining with an immense, almost painful pride, but underneath it, a flicker of worry. I am so proud of you, Mija, Elena said, her hand finding Isabella's. But be careful. Men like that, the ones with too much money and no soul, they do not like to lose. Her mother's words were a faint, distant echo of the chill she'd felt from Lorenzo's stare in the courtroom. But here, surrounded by the warmth of her family, the victory felt too real, too sweet to be tarnished. She dismissed the thought, allowing herself to bask in the pure, uncomplicated joy of the moment. Later that night, the joy had faded into a pleasant, bone-deep weariness. The deserted, multi-level concrete parking garage was an oasis of silence after the city's constant hum. The only light came from flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in her peripheral vision. Her modest sedan was parked in its usual spot, a lonely island under a buzzing orange light. As Isabella walked toward it, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the grimy concrete, a pair of headlights flashed to life. A luxury black car, sleek and silent as a panther, pulled out from a darkened corner, blocking her path. Her heart leaped into her throat. The car idled, its engine a low, menacing purr. The driver's side door opened, and a figure emerged. Lorenzo Bianchi, the polished, legitimate businessman facade from the courtroom was gone. It had been stripped away, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. His posture was different, looser, more predatory. The coldness in his eyes was no longer a passive trait, but an active, overt force. He didn't speak, just started walking toward her. Isabella was frozen, her keys clutched so tightly in her hand, the metal bit into her palm. He cornered her against the driver's side door of her own car. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical force, a wall of intimidation that stole the air from her lungs. The smell of gasoline and damp concrete filled her senses, mingling with the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. That was quite a performance in there, Miss Cruz, he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. He was so close she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the intricate pattern of his silk tie. The dim light caught the sharp cut of his suit and the metallic glint of an expensive watch on his wrist. You have a fire in you, a passion for the underdog. He paused, his eyes raking over her, making her feel exposed, vulnerable. You didn't win, you just got my attention. Isabella's elation from hours before had completely evaporated, replaced by a pure, primal fear. The man from the courtroom and this man in the garage felt like two entirely different beings. She felt trapped, a mouse cornered by a cat. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. I have a position for a lawyer with your unique talents, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. A new case, you might say. You won't be fighting me anymore. You'll be fighting for me. The offer was so absurd, so insulting, it momentarily broke through her fear. It was a spark of her usual fire, a flicker of the righteous anger that had won her the case. You're insane, she breathed, the words coming out shakier than she intended. I would rather end my career than work for a criminal, she said, her voice gaining strength. I defend people from men like you. A smile touched Lorenzo's lips, but it was a cold, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes. He didn't try to persuade her. He simply held her gaze for a long, unnerving moment, then straightened up, giving her room to breathe. He turned and walked back to his car, the echo of his expensive shoes on the concrete, a lonely, threatening sound. He got in, the door closing with a heavy, solid thud. Isabella fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking violently as she tried to unlock her door. As his car drove away, it paused right beside her. The tinted window slid down with a soft whir. "A noble sentiment," Lorenzo said, his voice casual, conversational. "Loyalty to family is something I understand completely. Your mother's cooking smells wonderful from the street. Tell Leo to be careful on campus. It can be a dangerous place." The blood drained from Isabella's face. The casual, intimate details, her mother's cooking, her brother's name, his university, landed like physical blows. The threat was unmistakable, and it was terrifyingly, brutally personal. He knew. He knew everything about them. The victory she had celebrated just hours ago now felt like a foolish, reckless provocation. The safety of her world, the sanctuary she fought so hard to protect, had been shattered with a few simple, chilling words. He pulled away, his car disappearing into the darkness of the garage. Later that night, as she stood by her apartment window, staring down at the street, she saw it. The same black luxury car, parked across the road, a silent, menacing sentinel under a streetlight. It stayed for an hour, an unblinking eye in the night, before it finally, silently, pulled away, leaving only darkness and a cold, suffocating fear in its wake. The frantic ringing of her phone shattered the fragile peace of her apartment just after 2 a.m. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs before she was even fully awake, a primal instinct screaming that a call at this hour could only mean disaster. It was her mother, her voice a choked, panicked sob on the other end of the line. "It's Leo, mija. He's at Street Michael's hospital," they said. They said he was attacked. The world dissolved into a blur of motion. Isabella threw on clothes, her mind a maelstrom of terror and denial. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare of red lights and the imagined screech of tires. She found her brother in a sterile, curtained-off cubicle in the emergency room. The sharp, antiseptic smell of the hospital, a scent she associated with quiet suffering, filled her lungs and made her stomach churn. Leo lay on the gurney, his face a swollen, bruised mess, his arm encased in a thick plaster cast and held in a sling. A flickering fluorescent light above his bed cast a sickly, pale glow on his skin. "Leo, oh my God," she whispered, rushing to his side, her hand hovering over his uninjured cheek, afraid to touch him. He flinched, his eyes darting away from hers. "It was nothing, Izzy," he muttered, the words slurring slightly through a split lip. "Just some guys. They wanted my wallet. I fought back. It was stupid." His story was vague, flimsy, and he couldn't meet her gaze. He stared at a fixed point on the opposite wall, his jaw tight with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. When a police officer finally came to take a statement, he was dismissive, his pen scratching lazily across his notepad. "Sounds like a random mugging," he said with a world-weary sigh. "Happens all the time in that neighborhood. We'll file a report." It was a dead end, a bureaucratic shrug, and Isabella knew it. Her legal skills, her ability to command a courtroom with logic and evidence, were utterly useless here. This wasn't a system she could navigate. It was a blunt instrument that had been taken to her family. A cold, sickening dread began to pool in her stomach. This wasn't random. This was a message, delivered with brutal efficiency. This was her fault. Her defiance, her proud victory in that courtroom, had brought this down on them. She had poked the beast, and it had swiped back, not at her, but at the one thing she held most precious. The next morning, after a sleepless night in a hard plastic chair by Leo's bed, she returned to the apartment to get some things for her mother. As she approached her front door, she saw it. Lying on the worn welcome mat was a single, dead blackbird. Its feathers were a glossy, perfect black, its form still and unnatural against the brown coir. There was no note, no explanation needed. The message was brutally, terrifyingly clear. A bad omen, a promise of death. Her terror, which had been a frantic, chaotic thing, suddenly solidified into a grim, cold resolve. She felt utterly, completely powerless. Her law degree a useless piece of paper against an enemy who communicated with broken bones and dead things. That night, the city lights outside her bedroom window seemed to mock her, each one a tiny, indifferent star in a universe that had suddenly turned hostile. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the business card Lorenzo had left on her car's windshield. It was a simple, elegant thing, heavy black cardstock with a single phone number embossed in silver script. No name, no company, just the number. It felt heavy in her hand, a small rectangle of pure menace. For hours, she had debated, her mind a battlefield of warring principles. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest. To make this call was to surrender, to betray every ideal she had ever fought for. It was a desecration of her father's memory, of her mother's pride, of her own soul. Then, her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on her nightstand. It was from Leo's high school graduation. The three of them, her, Leo, and their mother, were huddled together, their smiles wide and genuine. Leo, so full of hope and promise. Her mother, her eyes crinkling with joy, that picture was her world. And it was a world she would do anything to protect. The self-loathing that churned in her gut was a bitter pill, but the fierce, protective love she felt for them was stronger. This is a sacrifice, she told herself, the words a desperate mantra against the rising tide of shame. This is not a surrender. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang only once before a man with a low, gravelly voice answered. There was no greeting, just an expectant silence. "This is Isabella Cruz," she said, her own voice tight and unfamiliar to her ears. She had to force the next words out, each one a shard of glass in her throat. "Tell him I accept." There was a pause, then the voice said, "A car will be waiting for you in 1 hour." The line went dead. Isabella closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. It felt like a tear for a death, the death of the woman she used to be. The car that arrived was the same black luxury sedan from the garage, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like obsidian mirrors. The ride was silent, the driver a silhouette behind a pane of dark glass. They drove downtown, to the heart of the financial district, pulling up to a skyscraper that pierced the night sky, a gleaming needle of glass and steel. She was led through a private lobby, into a private elevator that ascended with dizzying, silent speed. The doors opened directly into an office that was less a workspace and more a monument to power. It was a stunning, minimalist space on the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 2 sides of the room, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the city sprawling below. The lights of cars and buildings formed a glittering, complex tapestry. The walls were adorned with expensive, abstract art, pieces that spoke of wealth and sophisticated taste. In the center of the room sat an imposing mahogany desk, its surface polished to a mirror finish and conspicuously empty, save for a single, sleek laptop. This was the legitimate front for Bianchi Enterprises, but the atmosphere was anything but corporate. It was heavy, charged, the air thick with unspoken power. Lorenzo Bianchi stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at his kingdom. He turned as she entered, his expression calm, controlled, as if her arrival was not a victory for him, but a simple, foregone conclusion. "Welcome, Miss Cruz," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. 2 other men were in the room. One was older, in his late 50s, with shrewd, suspicious eyes and a sour twist to his lips. He was introduced as Marco, Lorenzo's second in command. He gave Isabella a look of undisguised resentment, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. He scoffed quietly, a small, sharp sound of contempt. "Another outsider," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The other man was younger, closer to her age, but built like a mountain. He stood near Lorenzo, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his face a blank, emotionless mask. His name was Dante, and his role was unspoken but obvious. He was a bodyguard, a living weapon, and his silent, watchful presence was a constant, quiet threat. Isabella felt like an animal in a cage, albeit a beautiful, gilded one. The sheer luxury of the office was suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on her. She felt Marco's raw hostility and Dante's unnerving, analytical watchfulness. She tried to build a wall in her mind, to retreat behind a facade of professional detachment, to see this as a transaction and nothing more. Lorenzo gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "Please," he said. She sat, her back ramrod straight. He moved to his desk but didn't sit. He leaned against it, the picture of casual authority. "Your family will not be harmed again," he stated, his tone flat, factual. "Their safety is now my responsibility. Your brother's medical bills will be taken care of, and he will have the best physical therapy available. Your mother will want for nothing." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting her understand the totality of his control. "In return," he continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers, "I expect your undivided loyalty and the full benefit of your brilliant legal mind." He laid out the terms. An exorbitant salary, 5 times what she was making, deposited into a new private account. A new apartment for her in a secure, high-end building, one of his properties, where she could be monitored and protected. The guarantee of her family's safety, a promise that was also a leash. It was a prison built of money and security. A wave of nausea hit Isabella. This was worse than she had ever imagined. She had pictured herself defending his organization from lawsuits, finding loopholes, fighting the kind of battles she understood. She was a shield. But as Lorenzo slid a thick, heavy file across the polished mahogany desk toward her, she realized she had it all wrong. The file was labeled simply Falcone. "Your first assignment," Lorenzo said, his voice taking on a harder edge. She opened it. It wasn't a defensive case. It was an opposition research file on a rival family. It was filled with corporate structures, financial statements, and surveillance photos. The Falcones. She'd heard the name, a whisper in the city's underworld, another powerful crime family. The file detailed how they were using a series of shell corporations and seemingly legitimate businesses to encroach on what Lorenzo considered Bianchi territory. He didn't want her to defend him from them. He wanted her to use the law to attack them. "The Falcone family believes they are untouchable," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He began to pace slowly in front of the window, a caged tiger outlining the borders of its territory. "They hide behind lawyers and accountants, moving money through charities and real estate, thinking their hands are clean. I want you to pull down their foundations, legally. Find every zoning violation, every broken tax code, every forged permit. I want you to find the cracks in their empire and shatter it. I want you to bankrupt them in the courts before I have to bankrupt them in the streets." The moral line she thought she could walk, the one she had imagined as a tightrope, had just been completely erased. There was no line, there was only a chasm, and she was being pushed into it. She wasn't a defender, she wasn't a shield, she was a weapon, a tool to be aimed and fired. She was being asked to do to others what had been done to her client, Mr. Al-Jamil, but on a massive, sinister, and devastating scale. She looked down at the file, at the names and numbers that represented another family's empire, and felt the cold, hard truth of her new reality settle over her like a shroud. The conference room they gave her was a sterile, white box, but Isabella transformed it into the nerve center of a war. Unable to refuse the assignment, and with the image of her brother's bruised face burned into her memory, she threw herself into the work with a vengeance that surprised even her. The sleek, modern space, once used for corporate presentations, was now her personal battlefield. The glass walls became massive whiteboards, quickly covered in a spiderweb of complex diagrams, connecting shell corporations to holding companies, tracing lines of credit, and mapping out the Falcone family's vast, hidden empire. She worked day and night, her legal mind, once a tool for justice, now honed into a ruthlessly sharp instrument of destruction. The intellectual challenge was a potent, addictive drug. It was a complex puzzle, a labyrinth of deceit, and she was uniquely equipped to solve it. She uncovered a web of corruption so intricate it was almost beautiful in its audacity. There were systemic health code violations in a chain of high-end restaurants the Falcones owned through a subsidiary, violations that were consistently ignored by bribed inspectors. She found fraudulent environmental impact reports for their construction projects, allowing them to build on protected land. And then she found the mother lode, a sophisticated tax evasion scheme that funneled millions through a network of offshore charities. A scheme so clever it had gone undetected for years. She was ruthlessly efficient, a shark gliding through the murky waters of corporate law. Lorenzo Bianchi would occasionally visit her office. He never spoke, never interrupted. He would simply stand by the door, a silent, imposing figure, and watch her work. He'd scan the complex flow charts on the walls, his dark eyes following the connections she had made, and she could feel his growing admiration like a physical presence in the room. It was a validation she hadn't asked for and didn't want, yet it fueled her all the same. One night, staring at a particularly complex diagram mapping the flow of money from a Falcone shell corporation to a supposedly independent charity, she saw it. A tiny, almost insignificant mistake. "Got you," she whispered to the empty room, a ghost of a triumphant smile on her lips. "You moved the money from the shell corp to the charity, but you didn't file the extension for the capital gains tax. A simple mistake, a fatal one." In that moment, she felt a sick, exhilarating thrill in her success. She hated herself for it, for the cold satisfaction of finding the weakness she could exploit. She justified it as a game, a way to keep her family safe, a way to survive. But when she caught her reflection in the dark glass of the conference room wall, she barely recognized the person staring back. The woman in the reflection had harder eyes, a tighter jaw. The wall she had tried to build in her mind, the one separating Isabella Cruz from the weapon she had become, was beginning to crumble into dust. Isabella was leaving late one evening, her mind still buzzing with tax codes and corporate loopholes, when she stumbled upon a scene in the building's secure underground loading bay. The vast concrete space was usually empty at this hour, but tonight it was occupied. Marco, Lorenzo's perpetually sour second-in-command, had a young employee pinned against a concrete pillar. Two of Marco's brutish enforcers flanked him, their expressions grim. The employee, a kid she recognized from the accounting department, was terrified, his face pale and slick with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. A shipment of high-end electronics had gone missing, and they suspected him of being a mole, of feeding information to the Falcones. Marco's hand was fisted in the kid's shirt, and he was leaning in, his voice a low, vicious snarl. He was about to get violent. She could see it in the tightening of his shoulders, the cruel twist of his mouth. Suddenly, a voice, lethally quiet, cut through the tension. "Marco." Lorenzo emerged from the shadows near the freight elevator, his presence instantly commanding the entire space. He moved with a fluid grace that was at odds with the brutal scene. "Let him go." Marco hesitated, his jaw tight with resentment, but he obeyed, shoving the young man away. Lorenzo's gaze was piercing as he approached, his eyes fixed not on Marco, but on the terrified employee. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "We believe he's the leak," Marco spat. The shipment was diverted. He had access to the route. Lorenzo's eyes flickered to Marco, a silent, cold rebuke. "Proof, Marco, not suspicion," he said, his voice dropping lower, yet carrying more weight. "We are not animals. We do not punish our own on a guess. Loyalty is earned, and it is repaid. If we betray that, we have nothing." The words hung in the air, a stark declaration of principles in a place she had assumed had none. Lorenzo turned his full attention to the young accountant, who was trembling so hard he could barely stand. Lorenzo's questioning was not brutal, but it was relentless, his gaze seeming to strip away every lie, every evasion. He didn't ask about the Falcones. He asked about the kid's life, his debts, his habits. Within minutes, the truth came spilling out. The kid wasn't a mole. He was just incompetent and in over his head with gambling debts. He had messed up the shipping manifest, a stupid, clerical error. Lorenzo listened, his face an unreadable mask. When the confession was over, he was silent for a long moment. Isabella expected, at best, a savage beating. Instead, Lorenzo looked at the kid with something akin to pity. "You're fired," he said simply. Your final paycheck will be generous. Use it to pay what you owe. Then you will take this severance. He gestured to one of his men, who produced a thick envelope of cash. And you will disappear, leave the city, start over. If I ever see your face again, I will not be so understanding. The young man could only nod, tears of relief streaming down his face as he was escorted away. Isabella was stunned into silence. She had expected brutality, a swift and merciless punishment. She had not expected this, a strange, almost honorable form of justice. Lorenzo's words about loyalty and proof, about not being animals, resonated deeply with her own legal principles. It was a confusing, contradictory moment that chipped another piece away from her carefully constructed image of him as a simple, one-dimensional monster. He was something far more complex and far more dangerous. A few days later, Isabella allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She was having lunch at an outdoor cafe in a bustling public square in the city's financial district, a small rebellion against the gilded cage of the Bianchi Tower. The sun was warm on her face, and the murmur of the lunchtime crowd was a comforting, anonymous hum. She was trying to remember what it felt like to be normal, to be a person who worried about billable hours, not car bombs. She had just taken a bite of her sandwich when the world tore itself apart. A massive explosion ripped through the square a block away, a deafening roar that was felt as much as it was heard, a concussive wave that slammed into her, throwing her from her chair and onto the pavement. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and for a moment, the world was a silent, slow-motion tableau of chaos. Panic erupted. People were screaming, running in every direction, a stampede of terror. A thick plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, staining the perfect blue. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a rising chorus of emergency. Isabella pushed herself up, her body trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. A car bomb. She knew it with a sickening, absolute certainty. And she knew who the target was. Lorenzo had a regular weekly meeting in a building overlooking that exact spot, a meeting that had just ended minutes ago. But the bomb had been indiscriminate. It had been placed in a crowded public space. As she stared at the rising smoke, her phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline was stark. Asterisk. Explosion in Hanover Square. Multiple civilian casualties reported asterisk. The blood of those people, the innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of a war she was helping to wage, felt like it was on her hands. The legal filings, the corporate takedowns, the intellectual game she had been playing, it all led to this. This was real. The game was over. The sight of the smoke and the sound of the screams made her physically ill, and she doubled over, a wave of nausea and guilt washing over her. That night, a shaken Isabella was summoned to Lorenzo's private residence. Not the office, but his penthouse apartment, a place she had never been. The space was dark and silent, the only light coming from the vast floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights. The distant wailing sirens were a constant, mournful soundtrack. Lorenzo wasn't triumphant or angry. He was quiet, brooding, standing before the window with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring out at the city he owned. He didn't turn when she entered, but spoke to her reflection in the glass. "Pour yourself a drink," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She did, her hands still shaking as she poured a measure of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "I hate this," he said, his voice tight with a controlled fury. "The chaos, the mess, involving civilians." He took a long drink from his glass. "It's their signature." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the cold control, a flicker of raw, unguarded pain. He told her a fragment of his past, a story he clearly had not told many people. When he was 15 years old, his parents were killed in a car bomb. It had been meant for his father, a man who was, at the time, trying to leave the life, to legitimize his family's business and escape the cycle of violence. The Falcone family, rivals even then, had been responsible. "This is what they do," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, venomous whisper. He stared out at the city, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely, a memory replaying itself behind his eyes. "They create chaos. They don't care who gets caught in the fire. My father, he wanted out. He thought he could make a deal, that there was an honorable way to end things. He let out a short, bitter laugh. The falconers taught me that you can never make a deal with snakes. You have to cut off their heads. Isabella looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the wounded boy beneath the cold-blooded Mafia boss. She saw the 15-year-old who had lost everything, who had been forced to become a monster to fight monsters. His war wasn't just about business or territory. It was a deeply personal vendetta, a wound that had never healed. In that moment, surrounded by the silent luxury of his apartment, with the city grieving below them, she felt a dangerous, undeniable pull of empathy. It was a connection forged in shared trauma and violence, a dark and twisted understanding that passed between them without words. She hated herself for it, for feeling anything other than revulsion for this man. But as she looked into his haunted eyes, she couldn't deny the pull, a shared darkness that bound them together. The shared darkness in the penthouse lingered long after Isabella had left, a silent binding contract that had been signed in the space between them. The car bomb had changed everything. It had ripped away the pretense of a purely legal game and exposed the bloody reality underneath. For Lorenzo, it was a painful echo of his past. For Isabella, it was a horrifying glimpse into her future. The war was no longer an abstract concept played out on whiteboards. It was real, and its casualties were tallied in blood on the city streets. The fragile connection forged in that moment of shared trauma and vulnerability had shifted the ground beneath Isabella's feet. He was no longer just her captor, her employer, the monster who had ruined her life. He was a man whose pain she had seen, whose vendetta she now understood on a visceral level. The next day, Lorenzo summoned her not to his penthouse, but to her own office, the war room she had created. The diagrams of the Falcone Empire still covered the walls, but they seemed like relics of a simpler time. Lorenzo walked in, his presence filling the room, his expression grim and resolute. The quiet, brooding man from the night before was gone, replaced by the cold, decisive leader. He didn't look at the Falcone charts. His focus was entirely on her. "The attack proves there is a leak," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They knew my schedule. They knew where I would be. Someone inside my organization sold me to them." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers, assessing her, challenging her. "Marco and his men will tear the organization apart with their fists, looking for the traitor. They will use fear and brutality, and they will likely punish the wrong person. It is a clumsy, inefficient method." He took a step closer, his proximity a deliberate test of her nerve. "You see things others don't," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "You see patterns in the chaos. You follow the data, not the rumors. I trust your mind more than I trust Marco's fists." He gestured vaguely to the network of computers and servers in the room. "I am giving you complete access. Personnel files, internal financial records, communication logs, everything. You are no longer just my lawyer, Isabella. You are my investigator. Find them." The weight of his words settled on her like a physical shroud. This was the point of no return. The line she had already crossed was a distant memory, a faint mark on a map she had long since left behind. This was an entirely new territory. She was being asked to actively participate in the internal security of a criminal organization, to hunt one of their own. It was a task that would require her to delve into the deepest, most protected secrets of the Bianchi family, a place from which there was no coming back. Yet, as the cold dread washed over her, it was mingled with something else, something she was ashamed to admit even to herself. A dark, intriguing thrill at the trust he was placing in her. He was giving her the keys to his kingdom, not because he was forced to, but because he believed she was the only one capable of navigating its treacherous corridors. She met his gaze, her own expression, a mixture of fear and resolve. "I'll find them," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. Her new role earned her the immediate and palpable hostility of Marco. He saw her not as an asset, but as a symptom of Lorenzo's weakness, an outsider who was poisoning the family with her soft, clinical methods. He decided to test her, to prove to Lorenzo that she was not to be trusted. The test was as clumsy as Lorenzo had predicted his methods would be. In a sterile, cold data room deep in the Bianchi building, a place where the only sound was the hum of servers, Marco accidentally left a file on a shared network drive. The file contained false information, a detailed plan for a major Bianchi shipment of illicit goods, complete with a route that was deliberately designed to be vulnerable to a Falcone attack. He then had one of his tech people monitor her network activity, waiting for her to access the file, waiting for the information to leak, so he could march to Lorenzo with proof of her betrayal. Isabella, however, had spent the last several days steeped in paranoia. She trusted no one. She examined every piece of data with the assumption that it was a lie until proven otherwise. When she saw the file, its placement so obvious, its contents so perfectly incriminating, her internal alarm screamed. It was too perfect. It was a trap. Instead of opening it, she began to dig into the server logs, tracing the file's origin. It didn't take her long. She found the digital fingerprints of Marco's man creating the file and placing it on the shared drive. She found the logs of the monitoring software he had installed to watch her. It was clumsy, just as Lorenzo had said. She saved the evidence to a secure, encrypted drive. Then she went to find Marco. She found him in his own office, a space that smelled of cigar smoke and leather. He was on the phone, barking orders. She waited silently until he was finished, her presence a quiet challenge. When he hung up, he looked at her with open disdain. "What do you want?" he grunted. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to his desk and placed a small tablet on it, the screen glowing with the log files she had uncovered. Marco's eyes widened as he scanned the data, the color draining from his face. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "This was clumsy, Marco," Isabella said, her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to his barely contained rage. "If you want to test my loyalty, you're going to have to be smarter than this." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm on your side, whether you like it or not. We both serve the same man. So stop wasting my time with these childish games, and let me do the job Lorenzo gave me." Marco was stunned into silence. He stared at her, this woman he had dismissed as a soft, privileged outsider, and saw a player as ruthless and cunning as any he had ever known. He had tried to trap her, and she had not only evaded the trap but had turned it back on him, holding proof of his insubordination. After a long, tense moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a sign of grudging respect, an acknowledgement that she was not a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. Isabella felt a surge of cold, hard power. She hadn't just survived his test, she had won. In that moment, she had solidified her position, earning herself a powerful, if reluctant, ally, and proving to herself that the woman she used to be was well and truly gone. With Marco's interference neutralized, Isabella focused on the real data trails. She worked with a singular, obsessive focus, the world outside her office fading away. The hunt for the mole was a painstaking process of cross-referencing and pattern recognition. She sifted through mountains of digital information, communication logs, financial transfers, and personnel records, looking for the one tiny anomaly that would betray the traitor. It wasn't in the big, obvious transactions. The leak was subtle, a ghost in the machine. She finally found it not in the communication logs, but in the internal accounting records. For years, a quiet, mid-level accountant named Arthur Pennington had been making small, almost untraceable transfers from various Bianchi accounts into a personal offshore fund. It was a classic case of low-level skimming, the kind of theft that often went unnoticed in an organization of this size. On its own, it meant little. But when Isabella cross-referenced the dates of these transfers with the timeline of the Falcone conflict, a pattern emerged. The skimming had stopped abruptly 3 months ago. Then, 2 weeks before the car bomb, she found it. A single, large payment of $250,000 into Arthur's offshore account from a holding company she had previously identified as a Falcone financial front. The picture was suddenly brutally clear. Arthur had gotten greedy. His small-time theft had been discovered by the Falcones, and they had blackmailed him. He had sold Lorenzo's schedule to cover his tracks and save his own skin. She pulled up Arthur's personnel file. He had been with the Bianchi family for over 20 years. The photograph showed a mild-mannered, grandfatherly-looking man with thinning gray hair and kind eyes. He looked like someone who should be coaching Little League, not betraying a mafia boss. There was no triumph in her discovery, only a grim, heavy sense of finality. She knew what happened to traitors in this world. She prepared a concise, evidence-based report for Lorenzo, each word a nail in Arthur Pennington's coffin, and felt a pang of cold, sickening dread for the brutal chain of events she was about to set in motion. Lorenzo summoned Arthur to a soundproofed conference room in the sub-basement of the tower. It was a room with no windows and a single heavy steel door. Isabella was present to witness, a silent observer in a drama she had authored. She expected a swift, brutal sentence. She expected denial, then screaming, then silence. Arthur was brought in, flanked by two of Lorenzo's men. The grandfatherly figure from the photograph was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged 20 years in a single day. His face was ashen, his hands trembled. The moment he saw Lorenzo sitting at the head of the long, empty table, he broke. He didn't even wait to be accused. He confessed immediately, collapsing into a chair, his body racked with sobs. He explained, his words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush, that his granddaughter, his only grandchild, had been diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder. The experimental treatments were astronomically expensive, far beyond anything he could ever afford. He had been desperate. He had made a mistake, and the Falconese had found out. They had given him no choice. Lorenzo listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not move, did not speak, simply let Arthur's pathetic, desperate confession fill the silent room. Isabella held her breath, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She braced herself for the inevitable command. After a long, tense silence that stretched for an eternity, Lorenzo finally spoke, his voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You betrayed my trust," he said, his words cold and sharp as ice. "That is unforgivable. You will leave this city tonight, you and your entire family. You will pack what you can carry, and you will be driven to the state line. You will never come back. If I ever hear your name, or see your face, or the face of anyone in your family in this city again, I will kill you myself." Arthur could only nod, weeping with a mixture of terror and relief. He was being exiled, but he was being allowed to live. But then, Lorenzo did something that completely shattered Isabella's understanding of him. As his men were hauling the broken, sobbing accountant out of the room, Lorenzo made a call on his private, encrypted phone. "It's me," he said, his voice low. "I'm sending you an account number. It's for a children's hospital in Switzerland. Arrange for an anonymous donation to be made to cover the full course of treatment for a patient named Sophie Pennington. All of it, make sure it is completely untraceable." He hung up and looked at Isabella, who was staring at him, her expression one of utter, uncomprehending shock. He saw the question in her eyes. "He broke the code," Lorenzo said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "But there are lines even we do not cross. The child is innocent. Her life will not be forfeit for her grandfather's weakness." Isabella was completely, utterly floored. This act of calculated, anonymous mercy was more shocking, more profoundly unsettling than any brutality could ever have been. It was a gesture of impossible complexity, a mixture of cold justice and profound compassion that she could not reconcile with the man she thought she knew. It shattered her remaining preconceptions, pulverizing the neat, black and white categories she had tried to place him in. He was a man who lived by a complex, and in some ways, deeply moral code, even if it existed in a world far outside the law. In that moment, her fear of him, the terror that had been her constant companion for weeks, was irrevocably mixed with something else, something powerful, dangerous, and undeniable. A deep, resonant, and terrifying attraction. A few days after Arthur's exile, Lorenzo invited Isabella to dinner. The invitation came not as a summons or a command, but as a request, delivered via a simple text message that felt jarringly normal. He asked her to come to his penthouse, specifying that it was not for work. The pretense of a simple boss and employee arrangement, already worn thin, was now gone completely. When she arrived, the apartment was different. The brooding darkness from the night of the bombing had been replaced by a soft, warm light. Music, a low, instrumental jazz piece, drifted from hidden speakers. A small table near the vast window was set for two, with linen napkins and gleaming silverware. It was not his office, it was his home, and the atmosphere was deliberately, dangerously intimate. He greeted her at the door himself, dressed not in a severe suit, but in dark trousers and a simple, well-fitted cashmere sweater. The change was disarming. He looked younger, less like a king in his throne room, and more like a man in his own space. He poured them both wine, a deep, complex red, and for a while they simply stood by the window, the glittering city spread out beneath them like a carpet of fallen stars. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. "I never asked you," he began, his voice softer than she was used to, "what you wanted, before all this." The question caught her off guard. She looked down into her wine, the deep red swirling. "I wanted to be a prosecutor," she admitted, the words tasting strange on her tongue, like a dream from another lifetime. "I believed in the system. I thought I could put the bad guys away, make the world a little safer. I wanted to fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "I suppose, in a twisted way, I'm still doing that, just not how I imagined." "You have a purity to you," he said, not as a compliment, but as a simple observation. "It's why you're so good at what you do. You see the lines between right and wrong so clearly. And you live in the gray," she countered, finding the courage to meet his gaze. "Did you ever want something else?" He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "I wanted the life my father dreamed of," he said finally, his voice a low murmur. He spoke of his father not as a crime lord, but as a visionary, a man who, in the 1980s, tried to legitimize the family business, to move them out of the shadows and into the light. He had been betrayed, murdered by rivals who saw his vision as weakness, a coalition that included the old guard of the Falcone family. Lorenzo, just a teenager, had been forced to take over, to protect what was left of his family and his father's legacy. "They took that from me," he said, a flicker of the 15-year-old boy's pain showing in his eyes. "They taught me that wanting a different life is a weakness your enemies will exploit. So I learned to be the one who aims, not the one who is aimed at. I became the monster they thought my father was, because it was the only way to survive." The vulnerability he showed was a calculated risk, and it landed like a perfectly aimed blow. It disarmed her completely. She saw the immense weight of the crown he never wanted, the life he was forced to build on the ashes of his dreams. In his story, she saw a dark reflection of her own predicament, the choices made under duress, the sacrifices for family. A powerful, terrifying intimacy began to grow between them, something far more dangerous than any business deal. It was a fragile thread of understanding, woven from shared pain and impossible choices, stretching across the chasm that separated their worlds. While Lorenzo and Isabella shared a moment of fragile connection, a different kind of meeting was taking place across town. In a dark, smoky backroom of a social club in the Italian district, Antonio Falcone presided over his own family. He was a man carved from old-world stone, his face a roadmap of violent decades, his eyes small and hard like chips of obsidian. He was enraged. His operations, from the docks to his construction fronts, were being choked, strangled by 1,000 tiny cuts. Zoning challenges, IRS audits, health code shutdowns. It was death by paperwork, and he was hemorrhaging money and influence. He slammed a thick, gnarled fist on the table, making the ashtrays jump. "This Bianchi pup," he snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "He thinks he's clever. He's not fighting us with bullets. He's fighting us with subpoenas." One of his sons, a man with his father's brutish face but none of his cunning, spoke up. "We hit him with the car bomb. He's still standing." Antonio waved a dismissive hand. "The bomb was a message. It didn't work. He has a new weapon, and it isn't a gun." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. His informants had finally given him a name, a face. Isabella Cruz, the lawyer, the one who had beaten them in court, the one who was now tearing his empire apart from the inside. "He's using a woman in a skirt to fight his battles." Antonio spat, the words dripping with misogynistic contempt. He saw her not as a strategist, but as a tool, an object. And you didn't negotiate with a tool? You broke it. We'll see how clever he is when he's scraping her off the pavement, he declared to the room. I want her gone, and I want it public. I want it messy. Send a message he'll never forget. You cut the head off the snake, but sometimes you have to crush the fangs first. The quiet, tree-lined street outside Isabella's new, secure apartment building was an illusion of safety. She was returning home late, with Dante at the wheel of the armored sedan. The dinner with Lorenzo had left her feeling unsettled, her internal compass spinning wildly. The intimacy they had shared felt both like a balm and a poison. As Dante pulled up to the curb, the street was silent, bathed in the soft glow of elegant street lamps. He got out to open her door, his movements economical and alert, a constant guardian. As Isabella stepped onto the pavement, the night silence was shattered. 2 cars, their headlights off, shot out from opposite ends of the street, boxing them in with a screech of tires. Doors flew open, and men clad in black, their faces obscured by ski masks, jumped out, assault rifles raised. It happened in a split second. Before Isabella could even process the threat, Dante reacted. He wasn't a driver, he was a warrior. With a force that knocked the air from her lungs, he shoved her back into the car, onto the floor, shouting, "Stay down," as he shielded her with his own massive body. The world erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. The car shuddered as bullets hammered against the armored plating and bulletproof glass, the impacts like giant metallic fists. The windows crazed but held. Dante, half in and half out of the car, drew his own weapon and returned fire. A steady, controlled series of shots that were a stark contrast to the wild spray of the attackers. Pure, heart-stopping terror gripped Isabella. The enclosed space of the car amplified the sound of the assault, the deafening roar of the rifles, the sharp crack of Dante's handgun, the ping of ricocheting bullets. She could smell gunpowder and the hot scent of stressed metal. She saw Dante flinch, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as a bullet found a gap in his cover and slammed into his shoulder. But he didn't stop firing. He was a wall of defiance, a loyal soldier determined to protect his charge to his last breath. Just as Isabella thought the armored windows would finally give way, that they were about to be overwhelmed, 2 more cars screeched around the corner, their tires smoking. They were Lorenzo's security vehicles. And in the lead car, in the passenger seat, was Lorenzo himself. His men, disciplined and efficient, engaged the Falcone attackers, their superior firepower and tactics immediately turning the tide. The ambush, which had been a chaotic storm of violence, became a one-sided firefight. Lorenzo, ignoring the ongoing battle, burst from his car and rushed toward Isabella's sedan, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury she had never seen before. It wasn't the anger of a boss whose asset was under attack. It was something deeper, something terrifyingly personal and possessive. He wrenched open the back door, his eyes scanning the interior, finding Dante wounded but alive, and Isabella, terrified and trembling on the floor, but physically unharmed. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so stark, it was like watching a mass crack. Outnumbered and outgunned, the remaining Falcone attackers scrambled back to their car and fled into the night. The entire brutal event had lasted less than 90 seconds. When Isabella saw Lorenzo standing there, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a protective fire that was aimed entirely at her, the terror that had frozen her blood was replaced by a wave of relief so overwhelming it almost made her pass out. Lorenzo didn't take her back to her apartment. He didn't take her to his penthouse. He took her to a place she had never seen. A stark, modern, and windowless safe house built into the sublevels of one of his downtown properties. Medics were already waiting, and they immediately took Dante to a separate room to tend to his wound. The adrenaline that had flooded Isabella's system began to fade, leaving her trembling in a quiet, charged space. The safe house was furnished with minimalist, uncomfortable-looking furniture. The walls were bare concrete, and the air was cool and sterile. It was a place designed for survival, not comfort. Lorenzo's control, the iron discipline he wrapped himself in like armor, finally snapped. He paced the length of the room like a caged tiger, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, his jaw tight. He said nothing, but the fury rolling off him was a palpable force. Isabella sat on the edge of a hard sofa, watching him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. Finally, he stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, his expression a raw mix of rage and fear. He reached out, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly, and gently, so gently it was a stark contrast to the violence of the night, he touched her face. His fingers traced her jawline, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, his eyes searching for any injury his frantic gaze might have missed. The professional distance between them, the carefully constructed lines of employer and employee, of captor and captive, evaporated in that single, trembling touch. "When I got the call," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before, a ragged edge of vulnerability that cut through his authority. "When Marco's man screamed into the phone that you were under attack, when I saw their cars boxing you in, He stopped, swallowing hard, his throat working. "In that moment, I realized that destroying the Falcones means nothing if I lose you." His dark eyes, stripped of all their usual defenses, locked onto hers. "You are not a part of the deal anymore, Isabella. You are not a weapon or an asset." He took a shaky breath, the confession torn from the deepest part of him. "You are the reason for it." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of her internal defenses. Her fear, her guilt, her righteous anger, it all melted away, replaced by the powerful, undeniable truth of her own feelings. This man, this impossible, dangerous man who had taken her life apart piece by piece, had also become its most fierce and devoted protector. The conflict that had raged inside her for weeks, the war between her principles and her survival, resolved itself in a moment of pure, terrifying clarity. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it, a silent surrender that was also a declaration, and when he lowered his head and his lips met hers, it wasn't a surrender at all. It was a mutual claiming, a desperate, passionate kiss in the sterile silence of a concrete bunker, a seal on a new and dangerous alliance forged in fire and sealed with a choice. The sterile air of the safe house, once charged with the raw energy of their kiss, slowly settled into a new kind of intensity. The passion had been a flash flood, a breaking of dams, but what remained was a deep, powerful current of shared purpose. The attack on Isabella had been a declaration of all-out war, and the echoes of that violence reverberated through Lorenzo's organization. The safe house, once a sterile bunker, transformed into a war room. Laptops replaced medical kits, and encrypted satellite phones sat where bandages had been. Dante, his arm now professionally set in a black sling, stood guard by the door, a silent, wounded testament to the stakes of their new reality. Lorenzo's capos, the regional bosses who managed his empire, were demanding blood. Their calls, patched through on a secure line, were a chorus of rage, demanding a swift, brutal, and public retaliation. They wanted a street war, a bloody spectacle that would make the Falcones pay in kind. Lorenzo listened, his face a mask of cold composure. But Isabella could see the tension in his jaw. He was being pulled back toward the old ways, toward the brutal logic of an eye for an eye. She waited until he was done, until the calls for vengeance had ceased, and then she spoke, her voice calm and clear in the tense silence. "They want you to do that, Lorenzo," she said, stepping up to a large digital whiteboard she had commandeered. "A street war is what Antonio Falcone understands. It's a game he's been playing for 50 years. It will draw the attention of every law enforcement agency in the state. It will bleed both families dry, and in the end, the winner will be whoever is left standing on a pile of bodies, waiting to be arrested." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "You can't beat him at his game, Lorenzo. You have to change the board." She began to sketch out a complex diagram on the screen, her fingers flying across the smooth surface. It was a web of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and encrypted transaction logs that dwarfed anything she had found before. "I've been digging deeper," she explained, her voice filled with the cold excitement of discovery. "I found the linchpin, the heart of the Falcone empire. It's not their drug trade or their construction fronts. It's a direct, provable link between Antonio Falcone himself and a massive international money laundering operation run through a private bank in Switzerland. She zoomed in on a specific set of encrypted files. The evidence is all here. It's digital, it's undeniable, and it's protected by layers of encryption I've already broken. If we release this, not to the local police, but to the right federal and international agencies, it will trigger a global investigation. It will destroy him, his family, and his entire legacy, without another bullet being fired. She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of fierce intelligence and steely resolve. Don't fight him in the streets, Lorenzo. Fight him on a global stage where his thugs and corrupt cops can't protect him. It's not just checkmate. It's wiping his name from the history books. As they prepared to execute Isabella's plan, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, Dante discovered the anomaly. He was monitoring their internal network from a terminal in the corner, his one good hand moving deftly across the keyboard when his brow furrowed. "Boss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Someone is trying to access the Falcone evidence." The attempt was clumsy, a brute force attack on the encrypted server where Isabella had stored her findings. It was the digital equivalent of a thug trying to kick down a steel door. The intent was clear. Someone was trying to erase the evidence before they could use it. Lorenzo's face went cold, a chilling stillness settling over him. He knew. There was only one person with the access, the motive, and the arrogance to try something so blatant. Marco. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He, Isabella, and Dante returned to the Bianchi Tower, to the main office on the top floor. He summoned Marco, who arrived with his usual air of resentful swagger. He saw the three of them waiting, Dante's arm in a sling, Isabella standing beside Lorenzo, not as an employee but as an equal, and a flicker of unease crossed his face. "You wanted to see me, boss?" Marco asked, his voice attempting a casual tone that didn't quite land. Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. He walked to the bar and poured a single glass of water, his movements slow and deliberate. "I gave you everything, Marco," Lorenzo said, his back still to him. "My father trusted you. I trusted you." He turned, his eyes locking onto Marco's. "And you betrayed us." Marco's face hardened. "I did what was necessary." He spat, his voice rising with a self-righteous fury. "For the family, you've gone soft, Lorenzo. Listening to this outsider," he gestured contemptuously at Isabella. "She has you chasing paper trails while our enemies are trying to kill us in the streets. A king has to be a butcher sometimes. You let Arthur live, you let our enemy live. I made a deal to restore the old ways, to make this family strong again." He confessed it all, his belief in his own righteousness making him reckless. He had made a deal with the Falcones to remove Lorenzo and take over. As his confession reached its peak, his hand darted inside his jacket, pulling out a pistol. But Lorenzo had been prepared. Before Marco could even raise the weapon, Dante moved. Despite his injury, he was a blur of motion, stepping from behind Marco, his good arm wrapping around Marco's neck in a chokehold, while his other hand expertly twisted the gun from his grasp. Marco gasped, his eyes bulging, the fight draining out of him in an instant. "You did it for yourself," Lorenzo said, his voice as cold and empty as a winter sky. "And you broke the only rule that matters: loyalty." Instead of the swift, brutal execution Marco clearly expected, Lorenzo picked up his phone and made a call. "I have him," he said simply. He handed Marco, disarmed and defeated, over to a contact at Interpol, along with a drive containing meticulously gathered evidence of Marco's own illegal dealings. From extortion to trafficking, crimes Lorenzo had known about for years but had tolerated out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. Marco was to be extradited to face charges in a foreign country, a place with no friendly judges and no possibility of parole. It was a clean, quiet, inescapable end, a punishment far more sophisticated and permanent than a bullet. It was Isabella's way. The final act took place not in a grand office or a dark alley, but in a nondescript, furnished apartment miles from any Bianchi properties, a place so anonymous it was practically invisible. The only light came from the glow of a secure laptop screen, illuminating Isabella's focused expression. Using a series of anonymizing proxies and encrypted networks, she began the upload, The data package, a digital bomb of immense power, was sent simultaneously to the FBI's white-collar crime division, the international desk at the IRS, and a specialized financial crimes unit in Switzerland. She clicked the final confirmation. Send. The progress bar filled, and then it was done. A quiet click that sealed the fate of an empire. There was nothing left to do but wait. She and Lorenzo watched the news over the next 24 hours. The tension in the small apartment, a palpable thing. The first reports were small, local news items about FBI agents raiding a series of Falcone-owned businesses. Then, the story went national. News channels began showing live footage of federal agents carrying boxes of documents from the Falcone headquarters. Finally, the headline they had been waiting for scrolled across the bottom of the screen, stark and definitive. Antonio Falcone has been arrested by federal agents on charges of money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy. The Falcone empire, a dynasty built over a half-century of blood and fear, crumbled in a single day, brought down not by an army of soldiers, but by a single, brilliant woman and a keyboard. Isabella felt a strange, profound sense of calm wash over her. It was over. She had won. Not just a case, but a war. And she had done it her way, with her mind. She looked over at Lorenzo. He was watching the news report, his face quiet and unreadable. The vendetta that had defined his entire adult life, the ghost that had haunted him since he was a boy, was finally, truly finished. The city was quiet. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of gray and rose. On the balcony of Lorenzo's penthouse, the war felt a world away. The air was cool and clean, carrying the first hints of the morning. Lorenzo's organization was damaged, weakened by Marco's betrayal, but it would survive, and now, without its primary rival, it had room to grow, to change. Lorenzo stood beside her, looking out at the city. His city. He turned to her, his expression serious, the unreadable mask replaced by a quiet sincerity. "It's over, Isabella," he said, his voice low. "The deal is done. Your family is safe. I've arranged for a substantial, untraceable trust to be set up for them. They will never have to worry about money again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather passport holder and a single, first-class plane ticket. "You're free," he said, holding them out to her. "There's a new identity in there, clean and perfect. The ticket is open to anywhere in the world you want to go. There's a car waiting downstairs. You can walk away and never have to see me or this life again." Isabella looked at the ticket in his hand, then out at the rising sun. She thought of the black and white world of law she used to inhabit, a world of clear rules and moral certainties that had proven utterly incapable of protecting her or the people she loved. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a life that belonged to a different woman. Then she looked at Lorenzo, a man of darkness who had shown her a strange and complicated kind of light. A world of loyalty, sacrifice, and a passion so fierce it burned away everything else. She realized that going back was not an option, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. The woman she was before, the one who believed in the simple righteousness of the system, would have run. The woman she was now, the one forged in fire and fear and a dangerous love, made her own choices. She didn't take the ticket. Instead, she stepped closer to him, into the space between them, and took his hand. Their fingers intertwined, a natural, easy fit. She chose him. She chose this life. But it would be on her terms now. A partnership, not a prison. "What if I don't want my old life back?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, carrying the strength she had discovered within herself. "My work for you was based on a threat, Lorenzo. It was about survival." She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his, full of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. "But what we do next, that should be based on a choice. My choice." A slow smile touched her lips, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in months. "The case isn't closed," she said. "We're just getting started." They stood together, hands clasped, watching the sun rise over their city, a new, uncertain, but powerful alliance. ready to build an empire of their own design.